Picture a guy sitting alone in a secure room, no radio playing, no voice in his headset, nothing on a screen, and somehow information just shows up in his head. It's not a sound, it's not even something that feels like his own thoughts. He says it arrived whole, like he understood it before he had even had time to think about it. A few years before that, another man described almost the exact same thing happening to him. And decades earlier than either of them, a government engineer said an outside intelligence was handing him technical instructions, stuff he claimed he could actually build. Now, these three men never met, they never compared notes, never even ran in the same circles. But buried in all three stories is the same strange detail. None of them heard anything. Whatever it was, it didn't come through their ears. It just arrived inside their mind. And here's the part that got our attention. Some of the institutions around these guys didn't just laugh it off. They wrote it down, investigated it, and in a few cases spent real money studying it. So tonight, we're not asking if you believe in telepathy. We're asking something a little more uncomfortable. Why does the exact same kind of communication keep showing up over and over whenever people claim they contact something non-human? And before this is over, we're going to ask a harder question than that. Is there any way to tell an outside message apart from a thought your own brain generated? This is Beyond the Map. Quick reset on what we mean by telepathy here, because most people picture the sci-fi version. One person silently talking, another person somehow hearing the words. No, that's not really what these witnesses describe. So let's actually break it down because the specifics matter. There are basically four different things people lump under telepathy. One is auditory, a voice heard internally like it's coming from somewhere else. Two is conceptual, meaning that it shows up without words at all. It's just meaning and there are no words. Three, emotional, a feeling or an intention that seems imposed rather than felt. And four is informational, structured knowledge that arrives as one complete unit, a package if you will, all at once. But here's why that breakdown matters. If all three of our witnesses just described hearing a voice, well, that's a weak pattern. Lots of people report hearing voices for lots of ordinary reasons. But if they independently land on that same unusual combination, conceptual and informational, not auditory, that's a lot more specific. And that's not the common experience. That's the rare one. So as we go through Sherman, Sparks, and Smith, keep score. Ask yourself, does this one actually match, or are we forcing it to fit? First guy up spent his career around signals for a living. His name was Dan Sherman. Sherman served in the United States Air Force Intelligence, working electronic intelligence, reading signals for a living, figuring out what they meant. A pretty ordinary job on paper, at least. But in his book, Above Black, Sherman said something extraordinary happened to him. He claimed he was quietly pulled into a program that he called Project Preserve Destiny, and that he wasn't recruited because he'd seen a UFO. He says he was told he had some kind of biological ability that let him communicate intuitively with something non-human. Now, none of that's independently verified. There's no authenticated record confirming Project Preserve Destiny has ever surfaced. And honestly, his story gets stranger the further you follow it. But the detail that actually matters here isn't why Sherman thought he had this ability. It's how he says the communication worked and where it lands on the scorecard we just built. Now, he didn't describe some voice whispering in his head. That's the first thing to notice about Dan Sherman's story. He's already off the auditory category. He described something closer to a signal that he could mentally tune into. Now, during training, he said he'd listen to electronic tones and try to reproduce that same sensation internally until eventually he could get there without the equipment at all. Information would come in, he'd interpret it, and he'd report on it. He called it intuitive communication. And that phrase is doing some work because it points to the actual problem every one of the witnesses runs into. They're trying to describe something our language just doesn't have a good word for. Was it a thought, an intuition, a voice, a memory? Sherman's account sits in the conceptual and informational lane, meaning it arrived whole and then it got unpacked. One more detail worth flagging here. He said the information wasn't always clean. Sometimes it came through clear, sometimes it was garbled, sometimes his own emotions seemed to mess up the reception of the message. Now, that's not the smooth cinematic telepathy you see in movies. That's closer to a noisy radio channel, which conveniently is exactly the world Sherman already understood professionally. Here's the part of Sherman's account that sits with us the longest. It's worth pausing on. By his own description, he wasn't just claiming something spoke to him. He was describing having to sort out which mental impressions were his own and which weren't. Now, that's not a detail we're adding for effect. That's what intuitive communication actually requires. If you take his account at face value, a constant judgment call about the boundary of your own mind comes into play. So here's our first real problem. Was Sherman describing something genuinely inexplicable using only technical vocabulary he had? Or did that technical background just give him the perfect metaphor to build a story that sounds more credible than it actually is? Well, we can't answer that from Sherman alone. Good thing he's not alone. Jim Sparks tells a completely different kind of story. Starting in the late 1980s, he says he went through repeated encounters with non-human beings. There was missing time, physical exams, strange environments, and eventually direct interaction. Where Sherman was describing an assignment inside the intelligence world, Sparks says he was an unwilling participant. He claims he fought the experiences at first, but over time, he says they got more and more structured, and that structure included something like being taught. Sparks says the beings started teaching him a system of symbols, lessons, repetition, tests, and gradually, he says, he could understand information he believed was coming from them. Now, here's what makes this interesting next to Sherman. It's a real escalation, not just a second version of the same claim. Sherman said he learned to find the signal. Sparks says the signal was in effect teaching him how to receive it. Sherman tuned in. Sparks describes something closer to being trained by the source itself. Now, that's a meaningful difference in the claims, and it's worth being careful with the wording here because Sparks doesn't frame it as anything sinister in his own account. What he describes is closer to instruction than coercion. But strip away the framing and you still get the same underlying shape. Both men land on it. Communication that isn't ordinary speech. Now, it takes adjustment, recognition, practice, and eventually a kind of understanding that doesn't need spoken language at all. Now, a similarity between two extraordinary stories isn't proof that either one is true. By the time both men published their accounts, telepathic aliens were already baked into our pop culture. Contactees had been describing mind-to-mind communication since at least the 1950s. Science fiction ran with it even earlier than that. So this overlap could be cultural. It could be psychological. It could just be the predictable way that people explain something internal that feels foreign to them. Or it could be something real that we don't understand yet. To get past two modern accounts, we need something older, something that gives us more than a message, an instruction set. In 1950, a Canadian government engineer named Wilbert Smith proposed an official investigation into flying saucers. That became Project Magnet, and this part is fully documented. Smith worked with the Canada's Department of Transport doing radio engineering and telecommunications. He thought the UFO problem might point to a new kind of technology, something involving geomagnetism, gravity, maybe an unknown relationship between matter and fields. But Project Magnet was real. What Smith claimed after that is a lot more controversial. And this is where the story stops being just another testimony and starts being something that we can actually press on. Over time, Smith said he had a small group around him, and he had established contact with an intelligence that he called the boys' topside, and that he believed it was connected to the saucers. Now, according to surviving lectures and the correspondence that's attributed to him, this wasn't just philosophical conversation. He said it produced technical ideas. Walk through the progression the way Smith described it. The information didn't stay in his head. He said it moved onto paper, and from paper into components, and from components into a device, something he called a binding force meter. If that device demonstrated knowledge Smith couldn't otherwise have possessed, that would be extraordinary. That's the actual evidentiary threshold here. Not whether Smith believed something, but whether the output contained anything beyond what a trained radio engineer could have produced on his own. There's no accepted scientific validation that the device measured any real previously unknown force. And there's no reason an unusual device has to come from a non-human source. Smith was fully capable of designing his own equipment, but his own explanation was that at least some of the information came from somewhere else. Now, that changes the shape of this mystery. With Sherman, the alleged communications carried messages. With Sparks, it came with symbols and instruction. With Smith, it allegedly crossed all the way into engineering. The information wasn't just received, it was acted on in the physical world in a way that the other two cases never claimed to be. And that's exactly why Smith is the case worth spending the time on. Sherman and Sparks ask you to trust a description of an internal experience. Smith asks a sharper question. Did anything leave his mind that could not have originated there? One more thing worth noting. Smith's story is decades older than Sherman's or Sparks'. It precedes both of their books. It predates the internet era cross-contamination of every extraordinary claim with every other one. Now, that doesn't make Smith right, but it makes the similarity a lot harder to wave away. Before we go any further, let's actually do the forensic work most shows would skip. Let's put these three side by side and see if the pattern holds up under scrutiny. So here we have a comparison. We have Sherman, Sparks, and Smith. And this shows you the way the information came in. Sherman says mental tuning, while Sparks says repeated conditioning, and Smith claimed that there were contact sessions. The form of the signal was more intuitive with Sherman. There were represented symbols and supposed learning with Sparks, and with Smith, he received concepts and technical ideas. The recipient's role for Sherman was simply a receiver and interpreter, while Sparks perceived his role as being a student and participant, and Smith perceived his role as being an engineer and interpreter who could act on this information. The output for Sherman was reports, while Sparks had understanding behavior. That was the output. And then Smith allegedly created hardware. The device we showed earlier can't be 100% verified that that was a binding force meter, but Smith did allege to have produced such a meter. The primary weakness in these claims is Sherman has no program confirmation, while Sparks is testimonial evidence only. Not that that's bad, but that's all that supports it is his word. And Smith says there's no accepted technical validation of his device actually working. So, do these differences weaken the pattern, or are they exactly what we'd expect if three people were translating the same unfamiliar process through completely different backgrounds? Sherman interprets it like a signals guy. Sparks interprets it like a student would. And Smith interprets it like an engineer. That could mean the stories are culturally constructed, each man reaching for the framework he already had. Or it could mean the underlying experience gets filtered through whoever's receiving it. The same way three witnesses to the same car accident describe it differently depending on where they were standing. Well, we're not going to pretend we know which one it is, but that's a genuinely different question than do three guys tell the same story? It's the one worth sitting with. Now, let's stress test this a bit, shall we? Because there are plenty of ordinary explanations that could explain or account for at least part of what these people describe. Internal speech can feel, well, involuntary. Hypnagogic states, like when you're hypnotized, that fuzzy zone between wake and sleep, it can produce vivid voices, images, a strong sense of a presence. Trauma, dissociation, suggestion, expectation, all of that can shape how someone interprets an internal experience. And memory isn't a recording, it's reconstructive. Once someone decides an experience came from outside themselves, later memories tend to reorganize around that belief. Add in the fact that alien telepathy is already a familiar trope, and, well, you've got a pretty easy explanation for why someone might reach for it. Those explanations matter, but none of them fully account for the specific pattern here. It's not that these witnesses just claim to hear a mysterious voice. They keep going out of their way to say it's not that. They say it's faster than language, more complete than a sentence, sometimes structured enough to function as instruction. Robert Monroe, known for his work on altered states and out of body experiences, had a word for this: a rote, a compressed packet of information you receive whole and then unpack afterwards. Monroe's work doesn't verify any of this, but it gives us a useful comparison for what these witnesses are trying to describe. And that's the evidentiary problem in a nutshell. The only record we have is the witness's own translation after the fact. There's no original transmission to examine, no audio, no header telling us where it came from. Everything passes through the least reliable instrument in this entire case, the human mind. Mundane explanations on the table. Real evidentiary limits acknowledged. Here's a question worth answering before we go any further. Do humans even think only in words? Clearly not. I mean, we recognize faces, we understand spatial relationships, and we feel emotions before we ever put any of that into words. That doesn't demonstrate telepathy, not even close, but it does establish something useful. Meaning and language aren't the same thing. So the mechanisms these witnesses describe isn't as far outside the normal cognition as it sounds at first. The harder question is the second one. Can that meaning move between separate minds with no known sensory channel involved? That's where it gets genuinely controversial. Governments have a long track record of looking into extraordinary claims when there's potential intelligence or military value. That doesn't mean officials believed any of it. It means they weren't willing to write it off without testing it first. The U.S. funded remote viewing research for years. Later, a federal contract known as OSAP, roughly $22 million, running from 2007 to 2012, folded consciousness itself into a broader effort to categorize reported phenomena, alongside more conventional sightings and physical trace cases. Now, none of it authenticates Sherman's program. It doesn't validate Sparks' encounter, And it doesn't prove Smith got technical information from somewhere else that was non human. But it does establish something narrower: the idea that consciousness might interact with information in ways that we don't fully understand wasn't treated purely as entertainment. At various points, serious people spent real money trying to find out if there was any actual operational effect. Institutional interest is not institutional confirmation. Yeah, now that's a line we say a lot on this show, and it's worth repeating here. But there's a second half to that thought that matters just as much. The question was never whether government proved this. They didn't. The question is why the possibility stayed interesting enough to enough serious people in the government to keep testing it. And when you put these contact cases next to that history, an uncomfortable possibility shows up. What if the recurring claim isn't just that aliens communicate telepathically? What if consciousness itself is part of the contact mechanism? Not something that happens after an encounter, but the actual interface that makes the encounter possible in the first place. So far, every version of this story ends the same way: interesting, but unverifiable. Well, that's not good enough for this show. Let's actually define the bar. 4 things would have to be true before any of this crossed from claim to evidence. 1, unknown information. The recipient would need to walk away with something specific they had no reasonable way of already knowing. Number 2, independent verification. That information would need to be documented before anyone checked whether it was true. Number 3, repeatability. The communication would need to happen again under conditions someone besides the witness could observe. And number 4, external output. The information would need to produce something testable: prediction, a location, a design, a result. Now, run the 3 cases against that bar. Sherman largely fails there. The program itself was never independently confirmed, and the message content was never checked against anything outside of his own account. Sparks, well, that fails too, for a simpler reason. Everything about his case remains testimonial. There's no external record to check it against. Smith comes the closest. He's the only one who claims an external output at all: the device. But it still fails the bar because there's no accepted validation that the device demonstrated anything a trained engineer couldn't have designed on his own. Now, none of the 3 clears the threshold, but now you know exactly why and exactly what it would take for a future case to clear the threshold. The witnesses don't agree on who contacted them. They don't agree on why. And they don't describe the same beings, the same setting, or the same message. The mind wasn't just where the message got understood. In all 3 accounts, the mind was the equipment. Now that's the actual convergence. Not 3 guys telling the same story word for word, 3 guys describing the same shape of experience, translated through 3 completely different vocabularies. Our own thoughts often exist before we translate them into language. We already established that. If a non-human intelligence existed, direct transfer of meaning might be the most efficient way it could communicate across species. Every human language needs shared sound, grammar, culture. A direct transfer of knowledge skips all of that. There's no translation, there's no alphabet, no shared anatomy required, just the information itself. None of these cases cross the threshold that we laid out earlier. Not Sherman, not Sparks, and not Smith. We can't verify Dan Sherman talked to an alien intelligence. Can't verify Jim Sparks' encounter, and Wilbert Smith's experiments don't prove his ideas came from somewhere beyond Earth. Those aren't footnotes. Those are the actual boundaries of this evidence. But past that boundary, we're left with a recurring claim that strangely specific. Contact doesn't arrive as sound, it arrives as understanding. Maybe this is a shared mythology. Maybe it's just the human brain processes unusual internal states. Maybe people naturally reach for the same explanation when something strange happens inside their own head. Or maybe some of these witnesses are describing something real through the only instrument capable of receiving it, the mind itself. For decades, we've pointed telescopes at the sky, looking for a signal, radio waves, laser pulses, patterns, and noise. But maybe the hardest signal to detect would be one that arrives already translated inside the person receiving it. So maybe the real mystery isn't whether aliens can communicate telepathically. Maybe it's this. If something non-human wanted to speak to us, would we recognize the message? Or would we mistake it for one of our own thoughts? And if consciousness really is part of the contact mechanism, that might explain something else. Why so many of these accounts keep circling back to an even harder question to pin down: the human soul. If you're interested in that topic, I encourage you to watch Why Are Aliens Interested in Our Souls? It's up next. Thanks for joining us here on Beyond the Map. We're glad to be back in our new studio, and we hope you'll subscribe, like, and share.